I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Today on the show, we're getting into the Civil War, the politics, and the first moments of violence. Our discussion is with Jon Grinspan, author of the incredible book Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War, which came out in May of 2024. We interviewed Jon then for this conversation, and we aired it last year, but we're sharing it again because it's incredible. And boy, if you're interested in the Civil War, you're going to love it. If you're interested in politics, you're going to love it. If you're looking around saying, can things change quickly? You're going to love this, but you're also going to struggle with it because sometimes the change comes and it comes hard and fast. And when you finish this episode, you'll get what I mean by this. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to the patrons who support us. Patreon.com/theroadtonow. Patrons keep us going. Hope you're all having a good week and you enjoy this conversation with Jon Grinspan. Thank you.
I'm Bob Crawford.
I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now.
Our guest today is Jon Grinspan. He's a curator of political history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He's also the author of a book, The Age of Acrimony, that we discussed last year. Before we get into your new book, Jon, that we're really excited to talk about, I got to ask you about this. A couple months ago, it's Sunday morning. I'm drinking my coffee. I'm watching Meet the Press, which I do every Sunday morning. And Mitt Romney's on. And he's talking about this book he is reading, The Age of Acrimony. Did you know he was reading the book? And did you have any sense in your imagination that he might mention it on national television?
I had no idea. I was honestly, I was at the gym. I wasn't paying attention. I don't watch Sunday morning news, but my brother is a news junkie and started texting me. It was really kind of him. And we were able to get together and meet and talk history. He's a fascinating guy who really thinks a lot about history and has all these charts on the wall of his office that show different phases in world history. He's really clued in, and it was great to connect with him. So that was a highlight. That was very fun.
Did he ask you what you were working on presently?
You know, when you're working on something, it's not a question of ask. It's like just talks everyone's ear off until they get bored of it. So he was kind and interested. What a great guy. So I have nothing but good things to say.
I'm just curious if you sent him a copy of Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War, your new book, which comes out the day after this interview airs on May 14th. Did you get to share this with him?
I was lucky enough to. I'm giving it out to everybody. You know, this is something I've worked on for 17 years. I've been so psyched about this project for so long that, like, you stop me on the street, I'll give you a copy. It's just that energy at this point.
You know, I thought when Bob told me that story when we were hanging out this weekend, I said, I guess this is a good time to have a politician reference a good history book they're reading, because there probably isn't much competition in terms of other politicians mentioning good history books they're reading. So it seems like you've kind of got one of the few guys left in prominent in politics who is reading history.
You know, it's funny, at the Smithsonian, we have a lot of people come through, and I think there's an overlap between people who are interested in public life and politics, at least there was, and people who are really interested in American history. And it's, I don't want to sound condescending, but I am always humbled and shocked by how much people know about American history, and people who, you know, come in for a tour and then school me on stuff. So I think they're out there. A lot of people, as you know from this podcast, there are a lot of people out there who are really engaged in this material.
Well, let's talk about the Wide Awakes. Who were the Wide Awakes, and how did you find out about them?
Like I said, it's been a long journey. I was a grad student 17 years ago looking for a new topic that hadn't been done before on the Civil War. And we all know this is a topic in American history that probably has the most books about it, the most opinions, the most arguments. So it was like, what's left out there? And I was noticing that in a lot of books on politics of the coming of the Civil War, there were these kind of stray mentions of this weird movement of guys in the North mostly, but partially in the South, who wore military uniforms and capes and marched for Lincoln in the 1860 election. And it was always like a stray mention, like a paragraph, a sentence. And they kind of treated it like it was something silly and superficial. But maybe I'm a silly, superficial guy, but I really wanted to dig into who are these people? Why are they marching? And for me, they help ultimately explain a lot about how an election turned into a war and how you actually got people to go from politics to warfare. This question of like how we had a civil war in this nation I think it's still, even for all the explanations, it's still a mystery to a lot of us how it actually fully happened. And to me, the wide awakes are a little bit of a missing link that fill in, kind of make the story human and understandable.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think a lot of folks can't wrap their mind around is the two sides that fight each other in the Civil War, they have a similar story. I mean, their story, their origin story, their sense of place in the world, their sense of right and wrong, their sense of like historical importance. It's shared. And then you have, similar ethnic makeups, right? I mean, all the things that we look at as being kind of the key indicators of a conflict coming, a lot of those are really absent from the Civil War. And so, yeah, I think this is something that when we look for explanations for it, we're not even aware of how complicated a question it is.
Yeah, and I mean, so they're the wide awakes, and then there are all these movements in what would become the Confederacy to be anti-wide awake movements, what they call offsets. And it's so interesting to see at some point it becomes such a spiral towards war that the question is no longer, it's always a big picture question of slavery. But in a lot of people's minds, the question is, you were shutting down my opinion on your opinion on my opinion. They use the word coercion a lot. And at some point, it's not big policy issues. It's who's coercing who and who's imposing on whom. And I think the wide awakes and their opponents are a really good way to tell that story. In a democracy, who's stepping on whose toes.
So just set us up. Just tell us the story. Who are the wide awakes? Kind of the big picture story of who they are, what they do, and kind of what ends up happening to them later on.
All right. I know you guys did an episode on 1860 recently, an awesome episode. So maybe some of this is familiar territory, but we're going into this big ultimate election. 4 different candidates are running. The nation is fractured and split for a really long time. And there's a lot of public political violence on the ground. I mean, this is the era where they talk about mobbing in the street. There's over 1,000 kind of mob attacks on different people in the decades before the Civil War. And sometimes it's on, sometimes it's on bartenders, sometimes it's on brothel owners, but a lot of times it's on abolitionists. And there's a sense, especially in kind of the heartland of anti-slavery movements in like the Yankee North, that you can't even speak in the street against slavery. You certainly can't in much of the nation. It's a set of like free speech is being imposed upon. And a lot of people grumble about this, but there's really no strong pushback because the nation is so fractured. There's so many different populations. Some people want to end slavery tomorrow. Some people just want to push back. Some people are embroiled in the Know Nothing movement, are anti-immigrant. Others are recent immigrants who, can't get in the same party. And then in the winter and spring of 1860, kind of the beginning of the election cycle, these basically kids in Hartford, Connecticut, these working class guys who work in textile stores, they're at a march and they want to keep torch oil at midnight march with torches, and they want to keep the oil from falling on their new clothes. They're kind of snazzy new clothes. And so they cut some fabric from the textile store and make capes. And they march with these capes. And it seems like a kind of cool one-off thing. And they get in a fight that night with Democrats, instead of Republicans, and there's a lot of street brawling. And the movement kind of blows up from there. There's this idea that these uniforms are cool. The idea of marching at night is cool. Call yourself the wide awakes, like you're awakening to slavery. You're awakening to the problems of the country. And they build as a local movement and a state movement. And then it's really a national movement. It's in every northern state, every western state. It's in the kind of upper South and border South. It becomes really one of the largest political movements we've seen in our history up to the present day. And it starts with these kids in Connecticut who kind of make a funny uniform and run with it.
The iconography is so important to this. The branding, if you will, the branding. Yes. You talk about this as a youth movement and it spreads quick. Talk a little bit about how that branding, if we can use that word, you tell me the word that you prefer to use, because you, as your profession, you deal in these artifacts like all day long. Like this is what you do. And now you have a story to the torch, the story to the cape. Talk about the importance of the branding.
Yeah, branding's the right word, because a lot of these guys were salesmen, right? Like there's a network of people selling things, especially textiles around the country. And a lot of them start this movement. They pick these really simple, striking icons that are really kind of loaded with meaning, but not very complicated. So like their main symbol is wearing these black capes. And at first it's just to keep the oil from the torches off your clothes. But then it really starts to look like militarism and turns into a uniform. And they wear military caps like martial kepis, and they drill by military orders, and they give themselves ranks, and they really one of the elements of their branding is this militarism. But you can see in kind of Europe at the same time, in revolutions in Italy and Germany, the sense that like order and militarism will bring us into a liberal democracy. You know, it's kind of far into our sense of protest today where people want diversity, but the sense of order and the sense of militarism is really compelling, especially to people living in a country that's so fractured, that's so tribal, that's so violent. The sense that somebody has a plan and has an organization is really, really dynamic and really compelling. They use the metaphor of awakening. I mean, we live in an era where people talk about woke, and it's entirely different from what they meant back then. But across human history, the idea of waking up to problems is really compelling, especially if you have basically a conspiracy theory, especially if it feels like a small group is blocking your path or stealing from you. The idea of awakening, the symbol of the open eye, is really compelling, especially to these kids. They're 19, they're 22, they're young people who've grown up in basically a flawed democracy and a system that seems to be getting worse every year. So the sense they're finally waking up and they're standing up, not just against what they call the slave power of enslavers in the South, but also of their previous generations in the North, who they feel like have mucked up politics and are complicit in slavery. It feels like a mass awakening of young people, and it takes off with all these diverse populations who couldn't agree on very much else. So really, it really is well branded. I mean, you look back on it in the archives today and in the collections today, and it's still, some objects lose their heat and their punch over time, but you look at that open eye and it still says these people are mad and they're about to do something.
Well, I think the phrase wide awake works really well too, because as you point out, this movement takes on its own life. And you have a great quote in here where they constantly show up at Seward's house, William Seward. And he's like, please leave so I can get some sleep. And they're like, you're keeping me wide awake too. I've got work to do. And this gets at this fascinating story here of how the wide awakes, this movement that brings all these people together, they really are this unifying force that the Republicans need as a new party. But the party itself is not really in control of them. There's this relationship here where it's spontaneous, it's organic, it has its own leaders. The Republicans don't know how to control it. So how do they come into this story of the 1860 election and the rise of the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, we usually tell this story for very good reason, based on the elite politicians, based on a few guys, who's going to get the nomination for the Republican Party, who's going to run against them, these probably 10, 12 people who we kind of piece together this narrative for. And I think one of the reasons it's so hard to understand how this election ended in a war is because these guys all seem basically pretty polite, right? Like Lincoln is the winner, but Seward seems like a decent guy too. Chase, they all seem pretty reasonable, at least from my perspective. But when you tell the story from the ground, from these kids who are joining the Wide Awakes, who are 19 years old, 22 years old, who are, security guards, apprentices, clerks, who are forming this mass movement, you can feel how unstable it felt, both to people watching this movement rising especially from the South, watching this movement that seems uncontrollable to their North, and also to the elites in their own party. I mean, the Republicans people like Seward, who run the Republican Party and have fought so hard to organize this movement. It's really frustrating to see a bunch of kids outside your house at midnight marching for the cause you support, but also, stepping on your roses and waking you up in the middle of the night. And it's interesting to see which politicians roll with it and which tell the kids to go to sleep. Some people, like Karl Schurz, who's this German immigrant, a really interesting guy in Wisconsin, is great at talking to the wide awakes, playing with the wide awakes, but he's writing these letters at the same time to his wife saying, I'm getting no sleep. These guys are driving me crazy, but I basically have to play nice with them because they're the energy of our new party. And they learn over time how to work with them, how also to slow them down. Lincoln especially is really good at benefiting from the wide awakes without going whole hog on their worst and most dangerous aspects. So you see each politician in their own personality, how they deal with the actual challenge of having a mass movement. It's not easy to have a lot of people suddenly on your side who you can't control.
Thinking about the way the parties were structured before 1860, where you didn't have a sectional party, what made the Republican Party such a threat to the Union was that it was a sectional party, and we had never had that before. You had coalitions, both North and South, right? These are ideological commonalities that define the parties rather than sectionalism, which define the parties. But in that, it always, if you're reading like 1820 to 1860, it's like the South kind of pushed around the North. Like the Southern politicians, they call them dough faces. You know, you're going to vote with me, but I have no respect for you. You know, and it's kind of like you keep pushing somebody, keep pushing them, teasing them, pushing them. At some point, a generation's going to come around that's not going to stand for it anymore. And you start to see that in the late 1840s, like the very late 1840s, Wilmot and some of these younger Northern politicians, that they're kind of sick of taking the South's crap. They're sick of it. And so talk about how the tyranny of the minority leads to this youth movement against Southern aggression.
Yeah, and I think the way you phrase that is really important because it allows empathy for all the sides of the story, right? I think empathy is like the motor oil of history, and it makes everything make a little more sense. And you can understand why, starting from a Southern perspective, a sectional party is scary enough. And then when the sectional party is marching around with torches and uniforms, it really looks like, well, this is the end of this union. We tried really hard to play nice across our divisions, but this is the sign that it won't work anymore. That's a really understandable perspective that you're hearing from a lot of Southern voices, and especially people, you know, in between the extremes of the really radical pro-slavery side and the Republican side. In the North, there is a sense that the nation now has a Northern majority. When the country's founded, Virginia's the biggest colony. There really is a significant, not majority, but kind of a plurality of Southern voices. And so there are a lot of elements of the nation and of the Constitution and the structure that are Southern leaning. Seward says the country's leaning on its Southern side and it's moving to its Northern side. A lot of what happens here is not so much strong ideological stances against slavery for human rights reasons, but majority versus minority. And the North by 1860 has a significant majority. There are just more people there. If you look at the 100 largest cities in America in 1860, 78 are in the North. I mean, the South is a more rural region anyway, so that's a little bit of a slanted way of looking at it. But you can just see this larger and larger minority. But things like, you know, the 3/5 clause are all slanting power southward. And you look at the Supreme Court that makes decisions like Dred Scott, 5 of the 9 people making the Dred Scott decision are Southerners, 7 are Democrats, most of them are slave owners. There's really a disproportionate slant in power. And this is what people call the slave power. Not so much enslavement itself and the hard fact of that, but this basically disproportionate alignment of power. And so it's really hard to build a coalition of Northerners. They're the majority, but they all disagree and they all, as much as anyone else does. But finally, this sense of being imposed upon, being the majority who is not being listened to, being trampled over on things like what happens in Kansas, Nebraska, what happens with fugitive slaves who've gone north. There's this really, I think the most simple thing in politics is a sense that you are taking from me. And finally, after decades of not being able to build an anti-slavery coalition, this sense among people in the North that enslavers in the South are taking from them is what really builds a coalition. It's not that high-minded. I don't think it's really, for most people, anchored in human rights and real strong abolitionism. It is for some people, but there are a lot of people who are, you know, strong believers in white supremacy in the North who do not really want slavery to end tomorrow in Georgia, but they want to feel like they own the country now. It's really, I think it's more self-interested. And so the wide awakes are a great way of mobilizing that. And at the same time, because they make it about free speech, because they're marching for the right to criticize slavery, it links up the big Democratic Party that's also in the North. It's a way to fight their local enemies at the same time, who are also shutting down free speech in the North and in urban cities. So it's a good way of mobilizing against a lot of enemies under one slogan, basically.
Well, I think the kind of lost discussion that we have a lot in this country when we talk about anti-slavery is what you kind of got at this. The majority of anti-slavery sentiment is not abolitionism, which is just centered on empathy and human rights. It's the free soil movement.
Yeah.
And their concern is that everywhere that slavery expands, individual white families could get a bunch of little individual farms, or they could all be bought out by the mega wealthy slave owners who were going to take all the best land and do what they do everywhere else, kick the poor white people to the dirt.
You know, we see it all the time here, right? With like big pharma or big farming, and big pharma.
Big farming.
But they buy up all the little the family farms, the big corporations.
Yeah, and the profitability and then the political motive. And I want to, so a lot of times we pat ourselves on our back and we go, look at Bleeding Kansas. Those guys were fighting against the expansion of slavery. And then you have to be like, the Lawrence government wanted to ban all black people from ever living inside of Kansas. There's no good guys here. There's just guys that are pursuing their interests. But this is a fact that we all know as historians, if we study this era. But nevertheless, the way you added it in here is shocking. 2% of Americans in 1860 are slave owners. 2%. In a country where you were looking at, almost 4 million of the 31 million people are enslaved. And at some point, we talk about the 1%. Okay, so back then you had the 2%. But that 2% was redefining citizenship in the Constitution through the Supreme Court, redefining where slavery could spread, stopping and holding Congress's hand on whether or not they even had any authority over the territories. And at some point, that has to drive you mad. And I think your story tells a story of how these groups come together outside the context of high politics. And it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two examples to me that really jive with what you're saying are, first of all, the original Wide Awakes in Connecticut. They have a kind of a initial run in this, gubernatorial election in Connecticut in the spring. And it is among the most racist elections I've ever seen studying American history. The slogans are, I don't want to repeat these slogans because they're so nasty. I mean, this is a Republican Party. They're anti-slavery. But a large reason these guys are anti-slavery is because they don't want contact with black people. They live in Connecticut, which is extremely white at this point, before the Great Migration, and they view slavery as the imposition of African Americans on them. So their slogans are, for these wide awakes, these Republicans are in the anti-slavery party, but they're certainly not talking about, the races coexisting. And they're also extremely anti-immigrant, these same guys. So these are, no angels, the guys who start the movement. And on the other hand, there are wide awakes in the South. I mean, it's not the majority of the movement, but in places that were really part of the South in 1860, we might not see them this way today, like DC, like Baltimore, like West Virginia, like Missouri. Yeah, places we don't see this as much as the South, but it was slaveholding and they saw themselves as Southerners. They're organizing wide awake clubs too, because they're tired of these enslavers running the whole nation as well. So a lot of these arguments, first of all, aren't, I think, really great moral arguments, but kind of personal arguments over power. And second of all, they're as compelling to people. They're compelling to a really diverse swath of the country, I guess is the best way to say it.
In your research, what have you found about the Wide Awake's impact on why the Civil War broke out, when the Civil War broke out? Did they have any impact on the timing of the actual military conflict?
Yeah, this is the thing that took me so long to understand. I'm almost embarrassed because, like I said, I've been looking at these guys for 17 years. I've done work on them before, and I always stop my search terms at the election, right? Like you can use these newspaper databases or whatever and search, and I always basically plug in the 1860 election and things were kind of wrapped up after that. Like Lincoln says, well, that settles it. But we all know this is the most unsettled election in American history, and this election within 6 months is a war. It's not that the election stops and everybody goes home and then the next day they start talking about secession. The election is the starting gun for secession and for the war, right? It's one leads to the other. And the wide awakes don't go away. These guys in these clubs and these companies, many of them continue to meet and start saying, we should stop being a political organization and we need to become a military organization. And places like St. Louis, the leader there, Frank Blair, is buying rifles for these guys, turns this political club into an actual militia that does some of the earliest fighting of the Civil War. At the same time, people pushing for secession in the South, the small minority of people who are really actively pushing for secession from the day after the election, want to keep people afraid of the wide awakes. The more they can talk about this army in the North and the more they can scare people, the more that's like a crowbar to pry that part of the nation away and push secession. They're using this fear of the wide awake, so they keep them alive, and they talk about them a lot. There's this former governor of Virginia, Governor Wise, who you look at the things he's saying about wide awakes coming into Virginia, and they're not even distorted disinformation. They're just nuts. He's talking about wide awake Marines invading, Norfolk from the ocean. He's talking about wide awakes will soon slit all our throats, and he's using, similarly to how we saw Antifa used, he's using this fear of a political movement elsewhere to benefit his local cause. And you can really see this movement that you think is a political movement that's going to die the day after election, the way political movements usually do, turns into a paramilitary movement. And when the war begins, there's Fort Sumter, right? I mean, that's the beginning of the war, but no one is killed at Fort Sumter. The first bloodshed of the Civil War is in Baltimore and St. Louis. And in both places, there are either wide awakes fighting in the streets or anti-wide awake organizations fighting. That's the initial guys who really start shooting each other are motivated in large part by this big, either compelling or scary movement. So they don't go away. They turn an election into a war. And to me, that's the most fascinating part of their story.
You're at a point now which ties together so many of the fascinating parts of your book here. You get at this idea, like the wide awakes are a central player in this. And as you said, I love this moment where you go in to meet with your advisor. You talk about this in the preface where you go, I want to study the wide awakes. And he types it into like a newspaper database search and it comes with like 14,000 hits. Like, oh, those guys.
Okay.
Because he's like, I think we're onto something here. But the wide awakes play a huge role in this story. But I wondered if you think, because there's what they do on the ground. And certainly the Democrats in the North think that they're responsible for it because after Sumter, they're like, all right, I hope you guys are ready to go fight. You started this.
Yeah.
But there's what they do. And then there's what they're cast as being in the South. And I wonder, because we see so many of these movements now where we're divided, right? So something happens and you get the Fox News talking point about these people and the MSNBC talking point. And then there's what they're saying. It is a true story. There's two different interpretations. Each one of those versions of the story mobilizes certain people. So when you look back at this, there's parallels. Do you think what's more important is what the wide awakes do? Or do you think it's more important what they symbolize and the greater narrative being built in the South with John Brown and everything else?
That's a great question. I mean, the other element of that question is like, could they have done anything differently? Like on the one hand, here's this mass movement finally standing up against slavery, finally standing up, to defend democracy. And yet every time they succeed, they're also a gift to the people who are pushing for secession, which is, I really want to stress, a minority of people in the Deep South. It's not the majority view, but they've been campaigning for secession for years. And finally, they have Lincoln's a normal, nice, moderate guy. I mean, I know he's made out to be a demon, but like it's hard to get people too scared about Lincoln. But you have an army of guys in capes with torches marching in the north. It's a gift to these guys who've been wanting secession for years, right? But on the other hand, that's how you actually finally mobilize a movement. That's how you win the presidency. So was there any way, I know this isn't exactly your question, but was there any way they could have mobilized the movement that was compelling, won the election in this incredibly close, weird election that didn't also scare a lot of people and benefit the bad actors? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think it's a question we think about a lot today. Like, how do you, throughout American history or political history, how do you organize a movement that doesn't have negative knock-on effects? How can you kind of anticipate how they're going to be used? And like you're saying, the wide awakes, they loom so much bigger. The movement itself is big. It's several 100,000 people in a nation of 31 million. But people think they're 500,000 wide awakes, which is not the right number. I'm sure it's not the right number, but it is the number that's in every newspaper article. And that looms large. I mean, that is compelling. It gets people in places like Charleston and New Orleans and Baltimore to organize their own clubs to fight back against this movement. At one point after the election, as people were really debating secession in a lot of states, people start to use the word wide awake as a term to mean everyone you should be afraid of in the Union you should leave. Like, more than Republican, more than Yankee, more than Lincoln, the word that really they use as like a hot button term is wide awake. Why would you stay in a nation with the wide awakes? Why would you try to work and collaborate in this democracy based on compromise with wide awakes? They become this really ominous symbol. And I know you guys talked on your 1860 election episode about how kind of partial and weird Lincoln's victory is. He wins less than 40% of the popular vote. He wins a big electoral vote, but it's still a really fractured thing. But there's this movement that can turn this weird partial victory into looking like a big mass movement. And so the wide awakes make everything going on loom larger. They make abolitionism in the North, which is a small movement, a minority movement, look like it's a military force. I mean, John Brown has 22 guys with him when he goes to Harper's Ferry. The wide awakes have 500,000 people in a lot of people's minds. So of course it's scary to them. And you really see the political use of that.
How many references did you find coming directly from Lincoln about the wide awakes?
It's interesting. if you read the old stuff on the wide awakes, like there's no book, but there are articles out there, and a lot of people like to pretend like Lincoln created the wide awakes because he has the random good luck for the wide awakes that a couple nights after they form, there's this tiny little club in Hartford. Lincoln goes through Hartford, so they escort Lincoln down the street, and so the first thing they do as an official organization is escort the guy who's will be elected president 6 months later. It's good luck on their part, right? But Lincoln is really cautious about the wide awakes. We think of Lincoln as the speaker and the orator and the poet, but this is the period when what Lincoln doesn't say is as influential as anything else. And he thanks the wide awakes. He appreciates them as a campaign organization. He writes nice notes to them, but he's really clear that they're a campaign organization that have helped him in an election. And that's it. When there's talk about the wide awakes becoming a paramilitary movement, when there's talk, this is a really dramatic moment. When Lincoln is going to be inaugurated and is heading to D.C. from Springfield, there's an awful lot of talk, turns out later to be true, about the assassination of Lincoln, that he's going to be murdered in Baltimore, that he's going to be poisoned, that he's going to be blown up, that he's going to be stabbed. And as we know from subsequent events, it's legit, right? Like Lincoln's days are numbered. And a lot of wide awakes start writing to him that they can have 5,000 armed men go with him, that they can have 100,000 soldiers, paramilitary soldiers in D.C. by the time he gets there. And through his kind of surrogates, he really puts out the word, don't. You can go to Washington if you want as an individual, but do not come in these crazy wide awake companies with your uniforms. It's just going to make things worse. And he really stands down this bodyguard at a point when his life is in danger. It's really, I think, admirable, the restraint Lincoln shows there. And as the war begins, he tries to keep these people who are forming paramilitary forces within the Union Army because he knows, big picture, if he has a Republican uniformed paramilitary force marching around fighting people, he's got to scare away Democrats. He's got to scare away border states. He needs Kentucky. He needs Missouri. He needs these border states more than anything else at this point. So, this paramilitary partisan force is a negative at that point, and he's really careful about that without making him too mad. I mean, they still enlist in the Union Army and they still fight for him, but he really carefully calms down what could have been a really dangerous partisan mob at that point.
When we look back at the Civil War and its causes and really its beginning, people will say, all right, you've got Sumter, you've got, Bull Run, you've got all these, battles. Some people will look back and say, Bleeding Kansas as kind of a precursor or, a variety of places. But you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted you to talk about this a little bit. You point out that actually before you even get into the major engagements, there are street brawls in St. Louis and Baltimore that include the wide awakes, and far before shots fired, out on the battlefield, once the war properly begins, these battles go down and people die. So could you tell these stories of St. Louis and Baltimore, what goes on there and how they escalate this tension?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an exciting moment because I think a lot of us were taught a Civil War of guys in blue and guys in gray on a field in Virginia or in Tennessee, and so it's hard to understand how they got there, right? Like, how do you get to uniformed armies of Americans fighting each other? And the truth is they get there through escalating politics that leads to street violence. The first moment is in Baltimore. Fort Sumter has already been fired upon. South Carolina and a number of other states have seceded, but no one's been killed, right? Like, no one knows what this war is going to look like. And there are these clubs in Baltimore and D.C. called the National Volunteers. They form as what they call an offset to the wide awakes. They're mostly local Democrats who've been involved in kind of street level violence for years, fighting the know-nothings, fighting for the Democratic Party. And they form into a force that kind of riles people up in Baltimore. And when troops are coming through Baltimore to, essentially defend D.C. in the very beginning of this conflict, troops are coming from Massachusetts. They mob these troops. They start throwing bricks at them. It's just another of these mobbings that happens in this era. People start throwing stones and then bottles and then shooting, and a number of the Massachusetts soldiers are killed, and a number of the civilians in Baltimore are killed. These troops are, they're federal troops at this point, and they're firing back into a mob in Baltimore. It's not a good look, and you can see directly how Democratic and Republican forces become soldiers shooting at each other or combatants fighting each other. The other element on the other side of the Republic at this point is in St. Louis, which is, like Baltimore, one of the roughest, kind of most diverse and hard-fought cities in America. And there's this guy, Frank Blair there, who's, the scion of a really elite Upper South family in Maryland and Missouri. And they're with the Republicans. And he, along with a lot of German radicals who were in the 1848 revolution, have settled in St. Louis, turned the Wide Awakes there from a political force into a militia. They buy guns. They're secretly hiding out gunpowder all over St. Louis and secretly training in breweries and in restaurants. And finally, they strike at this kind of proto-Confederate militia at Camp Jackson and St. Louis. And they capture them. And they're marching them through St. Louis. Crowds turn out again. Same escalation we see of first they yell epithets, then they throw bricks, then they throw bottles, then they start shooting. And these guys who were campaigning for Lincoln start shooting into the crowd and kill like 30 Missourians. And this is how a civil war starts. Like when you look at civil wars in other countries, there's that point before their battles in uniforms when it looks like a paramilitary conflict. And I think when we tell our version of the Civil War, we skip over that. But when you look at Baltimore and St. Louis, this is what happens. These are political forces who just keep inching up towards militarism until finally they're killing each other.
What was the distinction of service for a lot of these guys, and how were they organized in the war proper as the war got on?
Yeah, a lot of these guys enlist. They basically say the Wide Awakes are done once the war is really starting. And they enlist in huge numbers in the Union Army. Like the original Hartford Wide Awakes, almost all of them go fight in the Union Army. Really huge numbers. But the funny thing is they're not distinctly great soldiers. There are a lot of people who are really mediocre Union War generals who were really prominent Wide Awakes and great speakers and talked really tough and wore the uniform. And then when it comes time for an actual war, they're not better than anybody else, and often they're worse. And also in the Confederacy, a lot of the people who, form the initial forces in Charleston, in New Orleans, that becomes the Confederate Army, they're in these offset clubs, these kind of Wide Awake responses to the Wide Awake. So, called the Minutemen in some places, named for political leaders and others. So the two armies that contend the Civil War, a lot of them have their origins in these kind of paramilitary political movements. But it's funny that the people who ultimately do the best in the Civil War, the Lees, the Grants, the Shermans, they're in the middle. They're usually not that partisan, and they turn out to be better ultimately than these guys who talked really big in 1860, which I think is telling and interesting.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the guy who's walking around at the bar being like, "What? I'll fight anybody in here," and he just gets knocked out in one punch. Like, there's a reason he's talking a lot. It's because he doesn't. Maybe he's worried the thing will happen.
Yeah, my favorite of that is Cassius Clay, who is has the same name as Muhammad Ali and is a Kentucky abolitionist. He's a really interesting guy, really cool. Before the war, as the war is breaking out, he kind of militarizes Wide Awakes in D.C. to defend D.C. And they say that every time he goes to the White House, he has another revolver on his belt. That he's got a Bowie knife, and then he comes back with a saber. And at some point, he's walking around the Willard Hotel with like 3 revolvers and a saber and a Bowie knife, and he's really like escalating as much as he can. And he turns out, as Civil War buffs know, to not be the most successful general in the field. So there is, in this era of politics, there's a lot of bluff. I mean, even in the dueling code, what's going on in the Capitol, a lot of this is like called bullying and kind of who can seem like a fighter and who can seem tougher, and an actual war is a really different thing.
I think that your story, when we hear this story about these groups going out and making, you brought it up, the way the right, talks about Antifa, or the way the left talks about any, these right-wing movements, which, there's some truth to these things, but they're not what they're made out to be when they're being used to stoke fear. You say in this book, and you said earlier, you spent 17 years working on this, and your own personal story of how you came about this, the lull where you couldn't get anybody to see any reason to do this further, just suddenly everyone gets it. It's a fascinating story about the way that our current moment determines what we can see in the past and what we can't. People couldn't see where these folks fit into the narrative because they couldn't get it. And then things change, and suddenly it makes sense. Could you tell that story about your own personal journey pursuing these folks from an academic endeavor to suddenly realizing this is something we can look at and understand the present better?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental question you're asking that we're all thinking about in one way or another as historians is like, the past is static and the present changes. So we're trying to talk about something that's already happened, but our perspective is naturally changing every day. And because I studied this weird movement over an awfully long period, things have changed a lot in American democracy. I don't think I need to tell you too much about that. But when I started out, what I liked about them was how obscure they were and how irrelevant they were. It just seemed like I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, and American politics looked really tame and calm and honestly a little bit dull. Like I wanted more action. And getting into the wide awakes, it's a story of like this dynamism, this passion, this militarism that like you didn't see in America 20, 30 years ago. And I thought that was cool. It was like a discovered world. And then as our politics have darkened, as we see more combat, as we see people marching with torches at Charlottesville, where I was working on this topic, it's really weird to start irrelevant and get relevant. And you don't want to exploit that. You don't want to seem like you're trying to benefit from things getting worse. But at the same time, sometimes in history, it feels like you have a useful key to try to explain what we're going through right now. But it's been interesting and upsetting and always kind of keeps you on your toes, watching how history changes over time. And I think it gets at this question we all think a lot about, which is presentism, which is like, are we biasing how we look at the past by the present, and how much is that inevitable versus how much is that harming our understanding of the past? I think there's a real tension there that we all have to grapple with.
Ben and I had to grapple with it when we were investigating the election of 2000, the campaign, and how non-issue oriented it was, just how irrelevant what the candidates were campaigning on seemed. And then the election itself is the thing that seems to trigger, in some ways, the moment we're in now. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking about that listening to your episode on 1980 when you were talking with Rick Perlstein about how the news kind of calmed down in the 80s and got really like news you can use and kind of a lot less aggressive and combative than the news in the 60s and 70s. And it's like, oh, that makes sense. That's why it was like it when I was a kid. And that's why the change has been so dramatic over our era and how we talk about political news.
Yeah, because human beings tend to think that the world they were born into is the way it always was, which is dangerous because then when things change, you feel anxiety. And then you fall for the person who looks around and goes, who did this to us? That's that guy over there. Let's get that guy over there. One of the stories I want to make sure that we cover, and look, this book is, if anybody's going, are they going to cover everything? We're not covering everything because this book is just, it's fascinating from so many angles. This is a story of American politics at a divisive point. It's a story of the coming of the Civil War, but it's also a story of the history of material culture. And at a turning point technologically in terms of availability of resources, in terms of employment, it really is this deep social history. Because when you look at what they do, the creation of the imagery, the mass proliferation of that imagery, that's something that's not possible really 100 years earlier because of just the simple lack of supplies. So could you talk about this history of the material culture of this movement, and then the story of the founders of this movement and where they end up, because that is also a story of the history of, daily life and culture.
Yeah, I mean, this movement to me is so fascinating in part because it's so physical and material and concrete, and they're not really articulate about what to do about slavery. You read the minutes of their meetings, like they have companies and they have meetings, and you read through the minutes, and they're not saying we should do this about slavery or we should do this about federalism. They're saying, I think our cape should be black with a yellow stripe, or we should wear a hat that's gray with a green band. And for a while that bothered me. You do research, you want them to get to the core of it, right? And then I realized that the materialism, the image was the message. And the thing that's most important to these guys who are young, who are fired up, is how they look. And that's a message about democracy in itself, because their image is order, organization in a time of chaos. So that's really compelling that you can, they marched in silence often, or they periodically yelled these kind of chants, but they're not rowdy. They're not raucous. They're not this wild 19th century we think about. Most of them don't even drink. They're really projecting order in everything they do. And so the material story is really interesting. And it's also, like you said, it's at a moment in history where people are kind of getting into consumption and consumerism, but it's not inundating yet. So you can go to the local textile store or general store and get some capes. You can get a copy of Hardy's drills for rifle and infantrymen, and you can form this organization kind of like a pastiche, like piece together from what you have in your community. That on the one hand is really material, on the other hand, sometimes it looks a little silly. You look at these pictures, and they're not wearing epaulets. They're not like militarism the way we think about it for Europe at that time. But they are really organized and branded, and that's why they're so motivating, exciting to the people who like them, and that's why they're so terrifying to people who don't like them, because they're not just a new political movement. They really do a great job projecting an army rising, and you read these accounts of people in Virginia, in New Orleans, who what are you doing? Why are you marching in these? Or even Northern Democrats were like, when did we say it was okay to march in uniforms to the polls? Like, when did this precedent become how democracy works now? And they're right. It's legit. Why? It's a pretty bad sign for a democracy when you see that happening. And these guys who organize this branding, it's really interesting. It's another thing. It took me years to understand. The first guy who puts on a wide awake cape is this 19-year-old clerk, Eddie Jurgensen. He sews his cape.
Yeah.
He kind of takes off, and then he kind of disappears a little. He's young. He's not well connected. You read his letters. His spelling's not great. He's not like a leader. He resurfaces. He fights in the war. He's a wide awake. He fights in the war. He resurfaces in the Gilded Age as like the most prominent interior designer in America. He redecorates the White House. He electrifies the White House. And this is the guy who came up with the cape and the torch to begin with. So, like, I guess there was something in his personality that had that design, that had that branding, first for a huge political movement in 1860, and then 30 years later as like a fancy designer in the Gilded Age. It's kind of funny to see those same skills and those same abilities that I guess was in his personality all along, at one point used for this really dark, compelling, dynamic movement, and then later used to make the White House pretty. The walls should be pink and pale blue or whatever. Like, it's cool to see those same skills in someone's life reappear in really different ways, really different eras.
This book also talking about like what happens that Ben's kind of alluding to. It charts the direction of the Republican Party and how it transforms from the party it was before the war, free labor, anti-slavery, into, the party and really essentially the abolitionist movement kind of abandons abolitionism after the party. They don't know where to go. Like, they're not equipped to deal with the aftermath of emancipation.
Thank you for listening
and the same
to the
thing
Road
with free
to Now.
labor.
If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts, or 5 stars on
a lot
Spotify.
of the people who are in that
or
movement look
spread
back
the word
on it
directly.
as the
Just
good
text
election,
a friend
which is
maybe,
funny
or share a link on
because
social
afterwards
media.
of the Civil
Anything
War,
helps
like, the
and we
consequences are
appreciate
pretty
it.
bad,
And
but
if you've got a
a lot
friend
of
who
people who
hasn't
are in
gotten into
politics for decades
podcasts
see it
yet,
as, like,
let
the
them know
time
they
when
can
they're
hear us
campaigning
every
for something
weekend on
just. They're all
Sirius
marching
XM's
in the same
POTUS channel
direction.
124.
And some of that is
Now
like
is the time when we
looking
say our
back with
special
rose-colored
thanks to
glasses,
our
right? Like,
supporters on
because
Patreon
it ends
and give a
in
shout out to our
emancipation,
Washingtonians.
1860 looks a
That
lot
list
cleaner.
is Tanya Marsh, Mary
But yeah,
Hawkins,
this is
Tim
the
and
moment
Caitlin
when this
Wells,
weird
Fig
coalition that you
White,
can
Matt
never get
Williams,
together of all these
T.
people
Martin,
who disagree
Ann
and often
Williams
hate
and
each
Frank
other
Edwards,
are
Nate
finally on the
Farter,
same side. They
Jennifer
have
and
a candidate
Magnolia,
they all like,
Chris and Teresa
or most
Adams,
of them like.
Joy
Lincoln is
Avery,
not
Edward
any of these
Carlson,
kind of, like,
and Aaron
he's
and
not a
Derek
superstar
Garrison.
he
Thanks to
becomes,
all you guys
but
for
everybody
supporting.
likes
If
him
you
enough.
want
He's
to support
everybody's
our
second
work
favorite,
and maybe
right?
get on that
You have
list,
this
you can
really
join us on
diverse movement. Some
Patreon at
people are radical immigrants
patreon.com/the
who,
road to
fought in
now.
revolutions
You'll get
in Germany
extended
and
versions
Italy
of select
and are really on the
conversations,
far
extra
end of the
episodes,
spectrum.
bonus
Some of them are
materials, and
abolitionists.
more. That's
Some of them
all
are really
available at
conservative. Some of them are former
patreon.com/the
know
road to
nothing. They're
now.
looking for another cause.
For more on the show,
And
visit our
having Lincoln
website,
and
theroadtonow.com, where
the
you can
wide-awake
easily search our
symbols
back
holds
catalog
them all
and quickly
together
find links to
just long
content.
enough.
Why is it so good?
They talk a lot about being the
7
majority.
Ages
I mean,
Design.
they win 39%
That's who
of
made
the
it.
vote. So
If you're
it's
looking
not
for
like
a
they're really the
website,
majority.
go check
but
them out.
They
The
make
Road to
themselves
Now is
feel like the
hosted and
largest
produced
force
by
in the
Bob
country.
Crawford and me,
We all
Ben
know how hard
Sawyer.
it is to get
Our
together a
associate producer
coalition,
is Gary
especially a
Fletcher.
coalition to
This
do something
episode
good
was
for one.
edited by Ben Sawyer, and our
1860 is
theme
like,
music,
if you
like
could explain
pretty
how they
much
did it,
always,
then
was
maybe
by
you can
Paul
figure out how you actually get
For
people
Bob Crawford,
who
this
disagree
has
on
been
the small
Sawyer.
stuff to
Thank you
march
for
together on
listening.
the big stuff.
Take care. The answer is fashion and good branding, apparently, Jon Grinspan. A history that's much longer than most of us thought. Well, we don't want to give away any more of the book. It's so good. And if you're interested in the Civil War, if you're interested in popular culture, what does it hold together? It also holds them together, getting together for unions into the late 1880s, where it's clear that these guys are doing well in all types of fascinating ways. Check out the book. The book is Wide Awake, The Forgotten Force That Elected Lincoln and Spurred the Civil War. Our guest is Jon Grinspan. Thank you for being here, Jon.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys.
Congratulations.
Yeah, this is great. It's so great.